The Russian army's Great Offensive, its months-long effort to seize the Donbass and break the will of the Ukrainian defense, has been decisively and catastrophically broken. The front in Ukraine holds, and the strategic narrative pushed by the Kremlin has completely collapsed. This is a story of total strategic stagnation, a failure so profound that the leadership is now forced to lie about territorial gains that are literally too small to measure. To understand the scope of this defeat, we must look at the quantitative evidence. The consensus from reliable military analysts confirms a devastating drop in Russian military effectiveness. The official figures show that the area of Ukrainian territory captured in September 2025 totaled just 259 square kilometers. To put that into perspective, this represents a nearly 50% decline from the amount of territory captured in the preceding month of August. This massive, sudden decline in pace is not a minor setback. It is the physical manifestation of an offensive that has completely lost its momentum and its strategic direction. The army is not just slow, it is static, trapped in a bloody positional stalemate that is consuming its resources at an unsustainable rate. This strategic collapse is made even more evident when we contrast the reality on the ground with the wildly exaggerated claims coming from the Russian General Staff. While the data shows a devastating decline in momentum, the propaganda machine continues to churn out maps that defy reality. The highest levels of the Russian command are boasting about sweeping gains and claiming control over 2/3 of key cities like Kupiansk. They claim to have encircled or taken major targets that are still firmly under Ukrainian control. This disconnect is the single greatest sign of a leadership that is fighting a war of virtual reality. The military command structure is so detached from the front that it is now basing its strategic plans on maps that are simply fictitious. This is a profound political error that reinforces the illusion of progress while the army bleeds in a real, brutal, unwinnable war. The quantitative failure has a critical qualitative dimension. The Russian army has failed to achieve its main intermediate objective, the complete capture of the Donbass. The entire summer offensive was a colossal failure because it did not result in the capture of a single major city, it failed to complete any encirclements, and it failed to achieve the decisive breakthrough that was promised. The tactics used, primarily the infiltration by small, unsupported infantry groups, are achieving gains so small that they are often below the margin of error for military analysts. This reality proves that Russia's army is incapable of generating the momentum required for strategic success. The attempt to measure progress by counting square meters of land is a pathetic admission that the only thing left to boast about is the fact that the offensive has not yet been officially called off. The strategic verdict of the summer is clear. The Russian military is stuck in a profound, self-exhausting loop. Its failure to learn from the early mistakes of the war, its stubborn insistence on flawed doctrine, and its reliance on sheer numbers has led to a situation where the army is simply unable to generate the force required for victory. The Russian command structure is now fighting a war that exists only on paper, and the troops on the front lines are paying the ultimate price for this institutional incompetence. The front in Ukraine holds not by accident, but because the strategic will and tactical method of the Russian army have been definitively broken. This stagnation is not a temporary setback, it is the inescapable prelude to Russia's eventual systemic defeat.
We have established that the Russian offensive momentum has been definitively broken. But the tragic core of this failure lies not in the static map lines, but in the unsustainable cost being paid for utterly meaningless tactical gains. This entire campaign has devolved into a tactical dead end, a bloody, self-exhausting exercise where the Russian military is hemorrhaging its most valuable resources for objectives measured in meters, not miles. The failure began with a fundamental miscalculation of the modern battlefield. The Russian High Command, still operating on a strategy of mass and maneuver, attempted to prosecute a 21st century war with 20th century tactics. The initial stages of the offensive were marked by disastrous, unsupported frontal assaults, where armored columns and massed infantry were sent against heavily fortified lines. This tactical choice was a catastrophe. The combination of Ukrainian drone superiority and precision artillery fire created immediate kill zones that obliterated the assault waves, burning through the army's limited supply of modern and even Soviet-era equipment. This indiscriminate sacrifice of manpower and armor proved that the conventional doctrine of the Russian military is obsolete against a technologically superior defense. But the failure was compounded by the subsequent desperate shift in tactics. Unable to win the frontal war, the Russian army resorted to light infantry infiltration, the prosachivani tactics, designed to exploit the gaps created by Ukraine's chronic infantry shortage. This new method, while achieving initial, deceptive gains, such as the 17-kilometer penetration near Dobropolye, quickly became a strategic cul-de-sac. The forward groups were light, relying on stealth and surprise, and critically lacked the heavy anti-tank weapons and fire support necessary to hold ground. When met with Ukraine's coordinated counterattacks utilizing heavy armor, tanks and fighting vehicles, and unmanned ground vehicles, UGVs, the Russian infiltrators were easily overwhelmed and eliminated. The initial gain dissolved into a vulnerable salient, proving that light infiltration is not a path to victory. It is merely a slower, more deliberate path to the same staggering losses. This constant, wasteful expenditure of men and material has pushed the Russian military to the brink of systemic collapse. The immense losses have created a vicious and unsustainable cycle. The army burns through its professional corps, forcing it to replace battle-hardened veterans with poorly trained recruits and long-serving soldiers who are being held illegally past their contracts. This reliance on an exhausted, often demoralized force only guarantees higher casualty rates, which in turn demands more recruits. The war is feeding on itself, and the only result is the rapid depletion of the nation's human and material capital. The military's own analysts, the Z-bloggers, are the most vocal witnesses to this profound exhaustion. They openly admit that the army is caught in a positional stalemate, incapable of generating the momentum required for a decisive breakthrough. They lament that the cost for a few square meters of destroyed land is too high, and that the only reason the offensive continues is due to the political demand for progress, not a military reality. The tactical dead end is the clear, devastating proof that the Russian army has been destroyed not just by Ukrainian firepower, but by its own flawed strategic doctrine, a doctrine that insists on paying an unsustainable price for a victory that remains eternally out of reach.
We've established the strategic futility of the Russian offensive. Now, we must turn to the factor that explains the most critical outcome of the summer campaign: the simple fact that the Ukrainian front holds. This resilience is not a miracle. It is a triumph of adaptation and technological superiority. Ukraine has built a new defense system that compensates for its severe manpower shortages, creating a lethal wall of technology that has systematically defeated Russia's conventional and hybrid tactics. The core of this defense is not a continuous line of infantry, but a dense, integrated aerial network. Ukraine has achieved, and is now rapidly scaling up, decisive drone superiority across key sectors of the front. This constant, omnipresent surveillance creates a level of battlefield transparency that is unprecedented in military history. The constant presence of reconnaissance and FPV drones means that Russian movements, especially the small infiltrating Prosechivani groups, are instantly detected. This aerial awareness is the first and most vital element of the defense. This battlefield transparency dictates a revolutionary change in infantry doctrine. The Ukrainian soldier is no longer tasked with holding a static line in a conventional firefight. As we've discussed, infantry units are critically undermanned. Therefore, their orders are simple: remain undetected and do not engage. The forward troops function as spotters, a decentralized network of eyes and ears that vector lethal force onto the enemy. The moment a Russian infiltration group is spotted, the response is not a burst of rifle fire, but an immediate barrage from FPV kamikazes and drone-guided artillery. This creates a lethal kill zone that eliminates the enemy without sacrificing Ukraine's limited human resources. A brilliant strategic maneuver that turns Russia's vast numerical advantage into a liability. The successful stabilization of the front is a direct result of this technological agility.
Ukraine is not just defending, it is actively fighting a counter-war defined by high-tech integration. The Ukrainian command has mastered the art of exploiting its internal lines of communication by deploying mobile elite reserves exactly when and where they are needed. These quick reaction units, often drawn from air assault or specialized assault brigades, are equipped to fight the new war. They use unmanned ground vehicles, UGVs, for fire support and dangerous clearance missions, and they are masters of integrating FPV data with artillery fire, giving them a decisive edge over the unsupported Russian infantry they are hunting down. This is a crucial distinction. The counterattack is not a brute force maneuver. It is a rapid, technologically enabled surgical strike to contain the breach. The long-term implication of this technological defense is clear. The Russian command, which has repeatedly failed to learn from its mistakes, is now being forced into a strategic dead end. Its reliance on infantry assaults and simple infiltration tactics is proving to be unsustainable against an enemy that is rapidly mastering the technology of the 21st century. The continued stability of the front is the most powerful evidence that Ukraine is adapting faster and more intelligently than its aggressor. The wall of technology has held, and it has set the stage for the final, inevitable conclusion of this war.
We have established that the Ukrainian defense holds because of technological agility, but the inescapable consequence of that resilience is a massive internal crisis now consuming the Russian military leadership. The offensive has failed, and the army is facing a crippling manpower debt that must be paid. The central question for the Kremlin is no longer if they must call for a new draft, but when they are willing to risk their political survival to do so. The sheer scale of this necessity has turned mobilization from a political option into a historical inevitability. The consensus within the Russian military analytical community is damning. They have concluded that the war is unwinnable with the current force structure. The persistent demand across all major Z channels is for a massive compulsory draft, with estimates of the required operational force ranging from 700,000 to 900,000 men. This astonishing figure is a direct admission that their current strategy of attrition and slow meter-by-meter advance is consuming their forces faster than the current contract system can replace them. The existing force is exhausted, the professional corps is depleted, and the only solution they see is brute force numerical superiority. A number large enough to simply absorb the catastrophic losses inflicted by FPV drones and artillery and continue moving forward. This necessity is compounded by a profound moral and legal crisis that is actively destroying the army from the inside: the scandal of perpetual service. Tens of thousands of experienced soldiers, the very personnel with the most valuable combat knowledge, are being held illegally at the front beyond the expiration of their contracts. They are denied rotation and discharge, victims of a desperate attempt by the state to avoid the political embarrassment of admitting the severity of their manpower shortage. This is an immense act of betrayal, subjecting the Army's most experienced corps to chronic fatigue, moral collapse, and legal limbo. This creates a critical risk. Should the mobilization decree ever be lifted, this vast reservoir of experienced veterans would stage a mass exodus, leaving the armed forces weaker and more amateurish than ever, thus necessitating an even larger, more immediate draft. Furthermore, any new mobilization would be a logistical farce and a moral tragedy. The system is structurally incapable of preparing a massive influx of new soldiers for 21st century combat. The current contract recruits are rushed through severely inadequate training cycles, often mere weeks, that do not prepare them for survival. They are then sent to the front lacking the most basic tools required to fight the war: FPV drones, electronic warfare gear, and even reliable medical kits. The Army is sustained not by its budget, but by the generosity of volunteers who purchase this essential gear. A new mobilization would simply require the public to buy uniforms, drones, and thermal optics for hundreds of thousands of new, ill-equipped conscripts. This is a cruel choice that proves the military high command is prioritizing political optics over the lives and readiness of its own soldiers. The leadership is trapped in a no-win scenario. They are facing a politically suicidal dilemma. Either call for mobilization, which guarantees public revolt and social chaos, or refuse to mobilize, which guarantees the slow, grinding defeat of their army on the front lines. The looming mobilization is the final, undeniable proof that the war has failed its strategic goals. It is a necessary solution to a military problem that the political regime is too weak to implement. And this fundamental contradiction is the single greatest factor accelerating the eventual collapse of the entire system. The final verdict on this catastrophic conflict is now unavoidable. We have meticulously tracked the systemic failures, the internal rot, and the political paralysis that defines the Russian war effort. The core conclusion is this: Russia has strategically lost the war, and the final act will be dictated not by the Kremlin's terms, but by Ukraine's. This outcome is assured because the combination of external pressure and internal military collapse has created an irreversible terminal crisis for the Russian state. The panic consuming the Russian leadership is entirely justified. Their strategic gamble to outlast the West and bleed Ukraine dry has been neutralized by their own internal contradictions. The military now faces the ultimate dilemma: the absolute, urgent necessity of a new mass mobilization. Analysts within their own ranks, the Z-bloggers and military insiders, are screaming that victory is impossible without a draft of 700,000 to 900,000 men. This is the only military solution, but it is also a political execution. The leadership is so terrified of the inevitable social backlash, of shattering the illusion of stability, that it is paralyzed. They are choosing to sacrifice the effectiveness of their army to preserve their own political skin, and that choice guarantees failure. This internal cowardice accelerates the external threat. The army is suffering a profound moral injury. The scandal of perpetual service, the illegal retention of experienced soldiers beyond their contracts, is actively destroying the professional corps, ensuring that any new draft would flood the front with highly expendable, poorly equipped troops. This systemic weakness is being met with a decisive response from the West. The green light to strike deep into Russia, the threat of Tomahawk missiles, and the acceleration of military aid are all converging on Moscow's financial and logistical choke points. This pressure ensures that the war is no longer a sustainable low-cost venture, it is a ticking time bomb. The war will end because the financial, moral, and political resources of the Russian regime are finite. The final act of this tragedy will not be a sudden battlefield knockout. It will be the slow, agonizing realization in the Kremlin that it can no longer pay the bills, it can no longer generate the manpower, and it can no longer enforce its will. The war has moved past the point of military analysis and into the realm of historical inevitability. Ukraine has not only held the line, it has successfully maneuvered its adversary into an impossible, unwinnable position. The cost of this strategic and psychological blunder is one that the entire Russian system will now pay.